Um, so thank you everyone for joining us. There are, as we see from the chat, a lot of excellent reasons why people want to learn more about public housing, especially now in the Twin Cities. We're seeing huge developers build housing and make profit off of what should be a human right. So even with affordability requirements, this housing remains unaffordable to so many working people, especially Black and Indigenous people and people of color. And as socialists, we believe that housing is a human right, and people are fighting for that right in a variety of ways. And you've probably heard about like rent control, zoning laws, public land trusts, but one of the areas that I don't think gets the credit it deserves is public housing. And our comrades at Defend Glendale Public Housing Coalition really lead that fight in the Twin Cities, and Kaha is with us tonight as an organizer from Defend Glendale to teach us about the history of public housing in Minneapolis, what is currently happening, and why it is important. So please take it away.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Kaha. I use she, her pronouns. I've been organizing with Defend Glendale and Public Housing Coalition for 6 years. I am a lifelong public housing resident in the city of Minneapolis. And not only do I believe that public housing is the future, I believe that is the end-all, be-all solution to homelessness and to houselessness. So I'm very passionate about it. I'm very excited to talk to you all about it today. And as I know that the base of this group are socialists, I think that we can all agree that housing does not belong in the private market. And so what does that actually look like in the US today? The answer is public housing. So that's why I'm really pumped. Is that the word? Like, I'm really excited to talk to you all about public housing. So yeah, I'm glad everybody said what they wanted to get out of this. This workshop will mostly be about sort of getting through what public housing is, what it looks like in the city of Minneapolis, why it's going away, and why we need more of it. And so I encourage people who have questions to drop their questions in the chat while I'm going. And one of the lovely people from DSA is going to give them to me as I go through, because there's a lot of basic things that we have to get over to like understand what's going on. And then at the end, hopefully, if we have time, we can have a discussion and talk back about what people think public housing should look like and what their hopes and dreams for public housing are. And so I'm going to share my screen. Oh, I can't. Okay. Also, I have cool. I can do that now. Also, I have a tendency to go a little fast sometimes, anxiety. So please let me know if I'm going too fast for you all, and I will slow down. Yeah, I'm so excited. Okay, so Defend Glendale and Public Housing Coalition, Public Housing in Minneapolis 101. So, history of public housing. Public housing was created in 1937 by the Housing Act, and public housing was created with the intention to house low-income families through the federally funded construction and maintenance of multifamily rental housing. And public housing houses some of the nation's poorest people, seniors, disabled folks, families, people who would not be able to otherwise afford housing often find housing through public housing. And yeah, the way that public housing works is that typically public housing residents pay 30% of their income, period. If a public housing resident has no income, then they pay minimum rent, which I think in Minneapolis is currently $75. So if you have no income coming in, you have no money, then you can still live in your unit and pay $75. The average income for public housing families is usually between $14,000 to $20,000. $20,000 for families of 4 and over, and $14,000 for individuals who live in public housing who are dependent on usually SSI and disability. Seniors and disabled folks who receive SSI usually get around $750 per month, that varies, or $9,000 a year. So public housing is the housing option for people who cannot afford to live elsewhere. The area median income for the Twin Cities, which is a number I'm sure a lot of people heard about, it's a number that's created by HUD, and that basically is the middle number for the 13 county area that surrounds the Twin Cities. The middle number of how much everybody makes is $100,000, but the area median income for Black families, which I think this number came out in 2017 and hasn't been since updated, is $33,000. So typically, Black families in the Twin Cities make a third of what white families make. And this is especially relevant when we talk about how public housing residents are 77% Black. 77% of all public housing residents in the city of Minneapolis are Black. So when we talk about the preservation of public housing, it's also really important to note that most of the people that live in public housing are Black, and how this is how being anti-public housing, I believe, is an anti-Black stance because of that. So this is a map, a property map of public housing in the city of Minneapolis. There are over 730 single family homes, which are called scattered sites. We're going to learn about those in a little bit. 42 high rises and Glendale townhomes, which is this little purple bit over here. That's where I live. And in addition to this, MPHA, Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, own lots of unceded, unbuilt, undeveloped land. They have huge lots and other properties that remain unused throughout the city. And we're going to talk about what their plans and hopes for some of those lots are at the end. But yeah, it's a lot. If you see all these dots, there's a lot of public housing in the city of Minneapolis, and I think a lot of people just don't know about it. If you live in a residential neighborhood, you probably have neighbors that are public housing residents. So who lives in public housing in Minneapolis? These numbers are a little bit old, but MPHA has not since released new numbers. We're just working with what they've given us. They're saying that 41% of all public housing residents are have a disability. I believe that this number is actually like a little bit underreported. I have a disability. Minneapolis Public Housing Authority doesn't know about my disability. There's a lot of disabled folks who live in public housing, but also there's a lot of people who are not on the lease who live in public housing. I know lots of people who live on top of each other, who live more people than there are rooms. And so I think a lot of these numbers are a little inaccurate, especially since they're so old, but this is what we have. So yeah, this is the number. 77% of all public housing residents are Black, and 24% were born in Somalia, and 7% were born in Ethiopia. So the large majority of Black people who live in public housing are split between East African refugees and immigrants and Black American folks from the States. And yeah, I always like to point out this household members by ethnicity, the Hispanic or Latino figure, because I think it's always really interesting to talk about how housing is also an immigration issue, because public housing is meant for the poorest people in the nation, but if you're undocumented or if you're insufficiently documented, you don't have access to public housing. So it's always interesting to talk about how I know lots of people who undocumented or don't have sufficient documents who live in public housing anyways because they live with relatives and friends of theirs, and these numbers are a little bit skewed. So yeah, this is who lives in public housing in Minneapolis. And it's also important to note that the vast majority of people who live in public housing are extremely young, are children, or are elderly. I live in Glendale townhomes, and 50% of Glendale is under the age of 18. So there's lots of young families that live in public housing as well. Yeah, do we have any questions? No? Okay. So, Section 8. Lots of people think that Section 8 is the same as public housing. It is not. The Department of Housing and Development, HUD, provides vouchers for low-income families to help them find affordable housing with private landlords. Public housing is maintained and operated by a government agency, typically a public housing authority. Section 8, although managed by public housing authorities, are in partnership with private landlords. So the units are not owned by, the government. They're owned by an individual. So recipients of Section 8 vouchers are allowed to look for apartments up to a certain rent, which varies for each metro region. This figure is called fair market rent. So basically what fair market rent is it's a fixed subsidy. So based on the area median income and some other figures, depending on how large your family is, you will get a fixed subsidy. So I'll come back to this in a second, but the resident pays up to 30% of their income in rent, and the voucher covers the remaining cost. This, however, is not really true in real life. This is what is supposed to happen, but it doesn't usually happen because of rents rise every year, and because of the corporatization of housing, fewer and fewer apartments and landlords are giving housing to Section 8 voucher holders. Many people either have to split the difference between the fixed subsidy that they receive and the rise in their rent and pay more than 30% of their income, or they have to move. And many people, in addition to paying 30% of their income, also have to pay utilities. So most Section 8 residents end up paying much more than 30% of their income. And Section 8 is just really problematic for a lot of different reasons. Many Section 8 families have to move because people stop accepting Section 8 vouchers, or their rents increase too much and their subsidies don't adjust to match that rent increase. And also because of stagnant wages, rising rents. We all know this. So that's why Section 8 is pretty problematic. PBRA versus HVCV. So there are two types of Section 8 that I think it's important for everybody to understand. The first type are the housing choice vouchers, which is what I just talked about. If I'm a mother, let's say I lead a family, I receive a housing choice voucher, I can take it to a landlord and say, hey, I will pay 30% of my income. This voucher will pay for the rest of my rent. That's what a housing choice voucher is. A project-based Section 8 is something like sewer towers or common bond. You see these buildings in a lot of different places across the Twin Cities. It's when the subsidy is tied not to the person. So if I have a housing choice voucher, I get to decide where I go with the subsidy. Project-based Section 8 is when the subsidy is tied to the building. So for example, if I move into sewer towers, I pay 30% of my income there, and it's a Section 8 subsidy, but if I move out, that subsidy doesn't follow me. So it's two different types. It's when the subsidy is tied to the building and when the subsidy is tied to the individual. That's the difference between PBRA, project-based Section 8, and housing choice vouchers. So yeah, this is a map from 2017 of all the Section 8 in the city. And yeah, there's a lot of people that live in Section 8. According to a 2018 Star Tribune report, 87% of Section 8 residents are people of color, 40% are disabled folks, and 37% are seniors. There are a lot of families. And so once again, I feel like this is really important when we talk about subsidized housing, particularly public housing in Section 8. The main people who are serviced by public housing in Section 8 are people of color, Black people in particular, and disabled folks. And those are also overwhelmingly the people that end up being pushed out of the city due to rising rents and unaffordability of housing in general. So, and this is a waiting list. This is from 2019. This is the newest waiting list information that they published. But there are over 10,000 households, individuals in the city of Minneapolis who are on the waiting list for single housing, 10,600 families that are on this waiting list for public housing, and this waiting list is closed. And 2,450 families that have applied for Section 8 vouchers in 2019-20, and that waiting list has also been closed. So the other thing when we talk about public housing is that it's not particularly accessible to anybody because waiting lists for public housing for this public housing elderly and disabled waiting list that is open that you see here. It's only open once a month, and you have to either go in person to apply if you need interpretation, or you have to apply online, which is not accessible to a lot of people, particularly seniors, who are the main people who are supposed to be applying for this waiting list. It's only open once a month, one day a month, like the third Wednesday of every month. It's like really inaccessible. It's really difficult to get into. So yeah, this is the waiting list information. We don't have any questions? No? Okay. So, uh-oh. Oh my God, what? Did this not load? Oh no. Okay. This is really bad. I'm gonna I'm gonna pull this photo up later, or, you know, 1 second. Oh my God, this is really bad. So it was loading fine before I shared my screen. 1 second. This photo is it demonstrates the difference between public housing and affordable housing, just so that people understand, because I think people get the two confused. This is really important, actually. I'm gonna stop my screen for a second and pull up the photo that I have on my computer, because I think it's important information that people should know. Stop share, 1 second. Sorry, y'all.
I also
Okay.
found the link on the Defend Glendale website and pasted it into the chat if folks are able to click on that there as well.
Okay, here it is. Do people see it? Do people see this?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, cool. So the difference between public housing and affordable housing. So basically, public housing is publicly owned properties and land under the Declaration of Trust, which we're going to talk about more later. And it's managed by public housing authorities and overseen by by HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And it is publicly funded through congressional appropriations and through additional funding with cities and states. And 100% of the units are affordable, meaning that you're only supposed to pay 30% of each household's actual income. And this is permanent. It's protected by the Declaration of Trust, which makes public housing public. Public housing is also governed by an executive director and a board of commissioners that are accountable to elected officials, and they're subjected to transparency measures such as government data requests, open meeting laws, and all of this money goes to a public good. But affordable housing, which I think people confuse with public housing often, is owned by private developers, investors, or nonprofit corporations. It's publicly and privately funded. Investors are incentivized to build through tax credits, state bonds, affordable housing funds, grants, and more from state, city, and county and federal revenues. And only a fraction of these units have to be affordable to qualify as affordable. I think a good example of this are artist lofts, which are technically affordable housing because they are built using government subsidies and tax credits, but I could never afford to rent an artist loft. And rent is based on area median income oftentimes, so it's not always affordable to the lowest income residents. Sometimes it's only affordable if you make $75,000 a year. And yeah, it's not accountable to the public, it's not transparent, and public money goes to private owners rather than to a public good managed by a public agency. So this is really important. I think this is probably one of the biggest things to get into, is that public housing is very different from affordable housing in every single manner because it is publicly owned and it's a public good. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to share my presentation again, and then we'll go into the next slide. But yeah, so that is the difference between public housing and affordable housing. Cool. Privatization. This is the biggest part of understanding what's happening to public housing in the city of Minneapolis, because public housing in the city of Minneapolis overwhelmingly is being privatized. So the Declaration of Trust, which I just mentioned. The Declaration of Trust is a legal agreement that allows for public housing authority to seize and hold properties under public status. It is the status that makes public housing public. When you remove the Declaration of Trust, it is no longer public. And LURA, which I'm going to be using later, stands for Land Use Restrictive Agreements, and it is a lease which allows private investors to lease public lands through low-income tax credits for a specific amount of time. With DOT, the Declaration of Trust, public land remains public, but under LURA, after the time allotted for the lease expires, developers have no obligations to HUD or to local public housing authorities. When Minneapolis Public Housing Authority published their 2020 MTW plan, which is their annual report, the removal of DOT, so the removal of the Declaration of Trust to the land use restrictive agreements, was marked as approved. But there was no announcement that HUD approved this transition, and MPHA did not notify public housing residents about this important change. This is really significant because when we talk about like the actual technicalities that make public housing public, this is what it is. And when you remove DOT, regardless of what happens afterwards, that is the privatization of public housing. That is the act of privatizing. And so we're going to first talk about Section 18, which is a really big, significant privatization scheme that's being used to get rid of a lot of public housing in the city of Minneapolis. Section 18, Demolition and Disposition, is a program through which public housing authorities can dispose of, or which means to transfer ownership. Disposition is a transferring of ownership, or demolish homes. Public housing authorities usually apply for Section 18 from HUD when properties are in such bad physical conditions that the housing authority can't rehab or repair them, making the properties unsuitable to house families. So this is significant because before Carson was head of HUD, and before Trump was in office, under Castro, when he was the head of HUD, there was a very long process that you had to do to dispose or demolish homes under Section 18, and there was a limit that you could do as a public housing authority. You could only apply for a certain amount of homes a year, not too many, and it was a 2-year-long approval process. But once Carson became the head of HUD, he said, you know what, if you get all your paperwork in within 30 days, you can dispose of as much public housing as you'd like. And so once this happened, once this change happened, and he stripped a lot of the tenant protections and the limitations for the program, public housing authorities all over the country rushed to get in all of their paperwork so that they could dispose of public housing and sell it off to developers. So this isn't just happening in Minneapolis, but this is the first time in Minneapolis where such a large amount of public housing has ever been privatized. It's historical. So Minneapolis Public Housing Authority has applied for Section 18 for all 730 of their single family homes, and they received approval for 717 homes. So 717 homes. They received approval to privatize 717 homes. They wrote in their proposal, they said, under HUD's Section 18 process, MPHA would transfer ownership of the scattered sites to a nonprofit established and fully controlled by MPHA. And this is the trick. They say that since this nonprofit is fully controlled by MPHA, which it isn't, we're going to find out soon enough, since it's fully controlled by MPHA, then it's still public. That's not the way that it works. If it's not under DOT and it's not managed directly by a public housing authority, then it's not public, even if it's managed by a nonprofit that's managed by a public housing authority. Nonprofits are not held to the same standards as public agencies. So this is really problematic for a lot of different reasons, but this is sort of the answer that they use when they say it's still public control. It's not public controlled. But yeah, 717 homes. I always like to impress that number because I think it's so significant. Imagine if the city decided to sell off like 15 parks, you know, because this is public land. There would be outrage, there would be uproar, a lot of people would be mad, there would be civic engagement, there would be probably a citywide vote, you know, but because it's public housing and because 77% of the people that live here are Black and because majority are like disabled, you know, then it's like, oh, we don't have to do public engagement. What's civic engagement, you know? But 717 homes. In the Section 18 application MPHA sent to HUD, MPHA admits that there is no scattered sites council and residents will be displaced. So for those who don't know, HUD gives money, federally funded money, to all public housing authorities across the nation so that they can create resident councils. These resident councils are for public housing residents to get information from their public housing authorities, be in communication and engagement with their public housing authorities and offer public housing residents leverage and power in their dealings with their public housing authority so that they can voice their concerns and also shape policy. But MPHA never bothered to set up a scattered site resident council so that all the different single family home residents had that opportunity. And they admitted this in their application to HUD, but because HUD is, in the business of privatizing public housing now under Carson, they didn't care. But City Council has not had any public hearings about the Section 18 application or process. Mayor Jacob Fry and Council President Lisa Bender both wrote a letter of support for it without a council vote or an opportunity for public comments. And none of the families living in these homes were notified at the beginning that MPHA was applying for Section 18, and they weren't involved in the process. So MPHA did not tell them when they began this application process. And so the way that this process is going to work is that MPHA will sell the 717 units for $1 each to a nonprofit called Community Housing Resources. And MPHA's planned nonprofit structure will only give MPHA 0.001% of control of the nonprofit, and 99.9% will be owned and controlled by private investors because the board will be majority private investors. Once the ownership of the homes has been transferred, the subsidy will change from public housing to Section 8. This means that there may be rent increases for residents because, like we talked about earlier, Section 8 is not always as affordable as public housing, even though it's supposed to be. Residents also are subject to private ownership, which means that MPHA is no longer the landlord. These contracts usually only last 15 to 30 years, but they can vary. So this is really significant that so much public housing has been sold off, and this is privatization in MPHA's own words. This says MPHA Apartments LLC, but this is from a few years ago. They ended up changing the name to Community Housing Resources, but these images show basically how MPHA planned on negotiating the ownership of this nonprofit. So, for example, Minneapolis Public Housing Authority landowner, and they're leasing it to MPHA Apartments, which is now Community Housing Resources. And then the MPHA LLC will be 100% owned by the nonprofit. Then owner of MPHA Apartments, look at this, 99.9% owned by the tax credit investor member, which is the investors and developers that will be on the board. And 0.001% owned by MPHA Apartments. So basically what they're saying is that 99% of the control of the nonprofit will be by investors. And they admitted this in their own presentation. And it's really funny because after we screenshot this and started using this 2 years ago, they removed it from their website and they removed it from all of their presentations. So they didn't want this to be known. Are there any questions about any of this so far? No? Okay.
Yeah, there's a couple questions in the chat. I'll pick one just to keep things moving. But Ari asks, well, they stated, but I think this is really a question. If they're selling it for $1, I don't even get the city's motivation for doing this. That's kind of a big question, but what do you think is the city's motivation for doing this?
Okay, yeah. So they're selling each home for $1 each to the nonprofit, and then the nonprofit will be managed by private investors. So that's pretty significant. It's not as if there's a lot of things. Basically, they say that they cannot, basically what MPHA tells people is that they can no longer afford to manage these homes, that these homes are too expensive for them, and that they will get money from these private investors to manage these homes and rehabilitate them and make them pretty, right? So that's what they say that their motivation is. But when we go further, I'm going to talk about MPHA's funding later and how MPHA actually is not as in dire need of of funding as they say that they are. But that's what they say the reasoning is, that they need money and they can no longer afford to manage these homes. The truth is, though, that MPHA proposed this program under the leadership of Greg Russ, who we're going to talk about later, and we call him the czar of privatization because he's privatized housing in Chicago, Detroit, Philly, Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's now the head of New York City's Public Housing Authority, NYCHA. So there's a lot of different reasons, and we're going to get to what some of the other reasons are, but that's their stated reason. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So this is the letter that Jacob Fry and Lisa Bender wrote in support of Section 18. And yeah, they said, preserving our city's existing affordable housing, especially deeply affordable housing for people below 30% of area median income, is a central pillar of our housing agenda. I find this really funny because most of the people that live in public housing make well below 30% of area median income, like we talked about earlier. The average household makes $20,000, which is definitely below 30% of the area median income, but also that this would get rid of necessary public housing. So, but yeah, lots of people in our city council, including Lisa Bender and Jacob Fry, are in big support of this agenda, and have done nothing to stop it, and have actually encouraged it. But this is the screenshot of their Section 18 application that I spoke about earlier. I know it's a little bit hard to see, but if you see under Section 7, resident consultation, will any residents be displaced or otherwise affected by the proposed removal action? If yes, date it. And so they said yes, and they dated it February 2nd, 2019. And then it was asked in the application, is there a resident council at the affected development? And they said no. Is there a resident council for all of the public housing residents in the city? No. Did the PHA, Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, receive any written comments from residents or resident groups, organizations during the consultation process? And they wrote no, which is funny because they actually received a large amount of written comments from public housing residents that we organize with, but also from us. We are an organization led by public housing residents, and so we qualify under that resident groups and organizations during the consultation process. So they just completely dismissed and ignored all of the written comments that they received from public housing residents and from our organization. So I feel like that also speaks to the level of disinvestment they have in the engagement with their own residents. And we're going to talk more about how poorly MPHA treats their residents, but they completely ignored all of their residents' feedback and powered through and told HUD that they never received anything. So what is rental assistance demonstration? I'm sure some of you have heard of RAD, but RAD is also a major privatization program that is being used to privatize public housing in Minneapolis, particularly Elliott Twins at the moment. Typically, the way that RAD works is that private investors get the property for free. It is then a transfer of ownership rather than a sale, just like Section 18. Usually, it is a free reign lease of land from 30 to 100 years. The new property comes with the promise of government subsidies, tax credits, and funds for decades to come in exchange for setting aside a certain percentage of the units as Section 8. And the number of Section 8 units are low, usually around 20% of the building, and they only have to be Section 8 for a certain amount of time, which is 15 to 20 years. In the case of Elliott Twins, which we're going to talk about in a minute, paperwork from MPHA came out this year and said that only, I think, 19% of the units will be Section 8. So it went from 100% public housing, where you only pay 30% of your income, to a much smaller percentage of all of the units in the building being Section 8. So yeah, RAD is a double handout. I'm a private developer. I get free subsidies, and I get a free lease of the land, of public land, for as long as I like. And I also get to raise rents because not everything will be 30% of the income anymore. More on RAD. Ed Getz, who's a professor at the University of Minnesota, wrote that Hope 6, which is RAD's predecessor, it's the program that RAD is based on, and Hope 6 is also the program that was used to privatize Glenwood Sumner Homes in North Minneapolis in the late 90s, that's now known as Heritage Park. That under Hope 6, only 1 in 5 residents moved back if they could afford the rent increases. And this is also really well known across the country. RAD happens all over the US, and it's very rare that residents are able to afford increased rents. But MPHA maintains that residents will not lose their units as a result of the RAD conversion, but this is a technicality. Residents can't lose their units as a part of the process itself, But after the conversion is completed, residents are subject to whatever new rescreening or application processes the new owner chooses. So if you have a record, a criminal record, if you have like a UD on your record or former evictions, you know, if you have a certain income that's below the new threshold that the new owner wants to reinstate, then you will not be eligible to be in your unit anymore. So you can't technically lose your housing as a part of the process, but after the new owner takes over, then you can lose your housing. And this has happened all over the country. In June of 2017, Greg Russ, who was the former director of Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, met with residents, and he said that the buildings are old and that they needed to be rehabbed, and that the residents will be able to move with the right to return, which is not true. In fall of 2017, MPHA's annual 2018 MTW plan, which is their annual report, was sent to HUD, and it named the first 5 properties to be privatized using RAD, which included Elliott Twins. Residents continued to say no and advocated against the program for years, since 2017. It's 2020 now, and MPHA pushed on with the plans. In 2018, the final RAD application was submitted, and residents were not informed of this submission. And it's also important to note that basically MPHA's whole thing is that these homes are in such bad shape and they can't afford to rehab them, but these apartments were fully rehabbed in 2008 and consistently get high ratings for their inspections, and they even have Wi-Fi. So I know 2008 seems like a long time because it was 12 years ago, but when we're talking about public housing and the scale of public housing in this country, 2008 is extremely recent because of how because of the slow of funding to public housing authorities across the country. 2008 is actually extremely recent rehabilitation. So that's always important to note. And in March of 2019, a copy of MPHA's eviction plan, which we called the eviction plan, but they call it Elliott Twins Resident Relocation Plan, leaked. And MPHA outlined step by step how they would evict the vulnerable, disabled, and senior and elderly residents from Elliott Twins through RAD. And this is all on their website. Residents may temporarily relocate to a hotel unit within Elliott Twins during the construction. Residents may temporarily relocate to a friend or family's home during construction. Residents may permanently relocate to a fully renovated unit at Elliott Twins project site. Wait, let's go back to number 2. Residents may temporarily relocate to a friend or family's home during construction. So we're talking about Elliott Twins, which is 2 buildings that are designated for seniors and disabled folks. And they're saying you can couch hop. That's what one of their options is for residents to relocate during construction. Another one of it is that residents, number 6, may temporarily relocate off-site to an MPHA, using an MPHA federal issued housing choice mobile voucher, which is a Section 8 voucher. But like we talked about earlier, it's really difficult for many Section 8 voucher holders in the city to currently find to find housing using Section 8. In fact, a lot of my neighbors who live in Glendale moved into Glendale because they couldn't find anything with a Section 8 voucher. And residents may permanently relocate using an MPHA Section 8 voucher. So I think this is all really important because this is the attitude that they're taking towards their public housing residents. This is how they plan on relocating them. And it's really important to understand sort of the callousness and the cruelty, the like just general casual cruelty of this whole privatization process, but also of the way that they plan on going through with it. Are there any questions? Okay. So I'll just go on then. RAD actually costs more money. A 2018 report by the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, found that the RAD program doesn't bring in anywhere near as much funding as private funding as its proponents claim. Whereas HUD claims that RAD raises $19 of private funding for every $1 public funding, the GAO reported that the actual ratio is only $1.23 of private funding for every $1 in public housing funding. This information can all be found on page 17 of the GAO report. According to the same GAO report, nationally, residents who undergo a RAD conversion are rarely able to return to their housing because their rights go unenforced. And when they do return, are often faced with a rent increase due to the subsidy change. Also, residents often can't return to their housing because they can be rescreened. And this is a quote. Owners do, however, have the ability to rescreen residents at the time of a tenant's annual or interim recertification in accordance with the screening eviction procedures found in their policies. So yeah, this report is really important. Actually, Maxine Waters, I think she said something in 2018 when this report came out and said that RAD is hurting poor families and Black families all across the country. We need to stop it. And after this report came out, the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, told HUD and said, HUD, we need to stop doing RAD until you can promise that all of these residents' rights are being enforced, because all of the rights that they say, like the right to return, aren't being enforced. But despite this, HUD continued to go ahead with the program, but this is important to know. Were there any questions? I feel like I heard somebody. Oh, okay. So, Warsame and Andrew Jenkins resolution. On Friday, December 7th, 2018, Councilmember Andrew Jenkins and former councilmember, current MPHA Executive Director Abdi Warsame became the new faces of privatization and displacement by authoring and passing a resolution at Minneapolis City Council that supported the privatization and dismantling public housing. And this is a quote from their resolution. Be it further resolved that the city supports MPHA's efforts to stabilize and increase its funding sources through exploration. Exploitation is code word for privatization, and implementation where feasible of federally sanctioned public housing conversion. Conversion is another code word for privatization, if certain conditions are met. And so, yeah, all of City Council supports this. Nobody in City Council has stood against this. And it's really dangerous because, like I said earlier, if this large amount of public land was being privatized and being given a free lease to banks and investment firms, like if this was happening with the parks, people would be angry. But because this is happening to housing that houses disabled and Black people, it's not the same level of outrage. But yeah, these are the new RAD and Section 18 updates, since most of the information I gave y'all was from last year. This is the newest updates that have happened in the last month. So according to our research, the homes, the 717 homes that were approved for MPHA's Section 18 process have been bought by MPHA's nonprofit entity, Community Housing Resources. Additionally, different firms and banks like Hunt Real Estate Capital are sending in proposals to invest in the public housing stock that Community Housing Resources owns, but we are not sure yet if this has been finalized. And MPHA has not announced its partners yet, just their proposals. Residents in scattered sites in the 717 homes were forced to sign new leases in March and May that they didn't understand under the threat of eviction, and have received a letter in the last month stating that improvements will resume in 2021. This language is unclear and doesn't explain where in the process MPHA is. Either way, because they've sold the homes to Community Housing Resources and removed the DOT, which is the Declaration of Trust, it is no longer public housing. But this could be easily reversed because these homes were sold for $1 each. It's $717. They could just give it back. So there is hope yet. Our hope is that before all of this conversion is finalized, and with partnerships with bank groups like Hunt Real Estate Capital, that we are able to put pressure on the city to reverse this and remove LURA and reinstate DOT over these homes, because these homes should be public housing. So we are still optimistic that this can be stopped, but optimism is the only way. And RAD at Elliott Twins. In the beginning of May, Elliott Twins residents were told to sign a new lease with Elliott's LP, the new management company, before the end of the month, under threat of eviction. Elliott's LP assigned a 99.99% interest, like a stake interest, to the Royal Bank of Canada's tax credit Equity LLC. This has been finalized over the last month, and just like with Section 18, residents were forced to sign new leases they didn't understand. This RAD agreement leases Elliott Twins land to the Royal Bank of Canada for 99 years. So it is official that Elliott Twins has been privatized. If you go on MPHA's website right now, they're actually very happy about this, and the first thing that you see on their screen is that Elliott Twins revitalization. It's like a whole thing that they're very proud of. But it's actually really scary that public housing has been leased to a bank for 99 years. It's really scary because of all the different things that we talked about before, about how residents may not have the right to return, how this has been happening under the threat of eviction, how residents' rights are going unenforced, but also it's scary because it sets a precedent for what may happen to the rest of the public housing in the city of Minneapolis. Public housing is a public good. It belongs to the public, and we are giving taxpayer money, right, to a bank, to the Royal Bank of Canada for 99 years. It's really scary. And yeah, it's really terrifying, but residents have been fighting against this since 2017 at Elliott Twins, and they are still fighting against it. Residents at Elliott Twins, in collaboration with the Glendale Public Housing Coalition, are having a press conference this coming Saturday. No, not Saturday, I lied, Sunday. Are having a press conference this Sunday to talk about their experiences of abuse and coercion at the hands of Minneapolis Public Housing Authority when it comes to this new lease, and to stand against the privatization of their homes and the sale of it to the Royal Bank of Canada. It's happening Sunday at 6 p.m. and I'm going to give more information about that at the end of the talk. But yeah, it's just really significant. This is one of the biggest things to know, that a new precedent has been set in Minneapolis for 717 homes and 2 high-rises to be sold without any civic engagement, without any vote at city council, without anything. Nobody has had a chance, not even public housing residents, because like I showed you in the application, even our written comments have not been considered. It's very fascistic. It's very scary. But I want to see if there's any questions about this, if anybody has any concern. Any questions about this before we go on to the next thing? I feel like there's some stuff happening in the chat that I can't see because I'm sharing my screen.
Yeah, no questions so far.
No,
We'll let
no
you
questions? Know. Okay, cool. So yeah, this is really scary, and it's really important to understand this. And also, just one more thing before I forget.
Oh, sorry,
it's really.
There's one question.
Oh, okay. What's the question?
Has anyone gone to the press with this?
Yes, there is a lot of documentation about our fight. In 2018, I think Shelter Force wrote this huge article about public housing residents organizing against this, and particularly residents at Elliott Twins. There have been some amateur documentary shorts about Elliott Twins residents organizing in the last 2 years. We have there's been so many articles written about us, frankly, but that amount of press hasn't changed anything. And I also think, before I move on to past Elliott Twins, it's really important to note the location of Elliott Twins, because I'm not sure if everybody knows where Elliott Twins are. But Elliott Twins are 2 public housing buildings that are right in the middle of Elliott Park, that are 5-6 blocks walking distance from US Bank Stadium and the train lines, and that are 2 or 3 blocks away from the hospital, HCMC. So when we talk about why Elliott Twins is the first to go, it's because of its prime location. If you go and look at housing in Elliott Twins in Elliott Park that's being rented right now, developers are rebranding it as Minneapolis's newest up-and-coming neighborhood. So it's really important to note how the location really affects why Elliott Twins is the first to be privatized, and also the amount of abuse that residents have been put under at Elliott Twins while fighting against. Residents have been coerced into signing new leases. They've been manipulated into supporting MPHA. they were demonized and being told that they were acting out by MPHA. I myself was kicked out of a meeting at Elliott Twins, and another public housing residence the police was called on them while protesting at Elliott Twins. There's a long history of the way that MPHA has actively antagonized its own residents and disrespected its own residents in an effort to build credibility, particularly with white people, in order to justify the privatization of public housing. But there's no justification for condemning disabled folks and seniors to homelessness. So that's just really important. But I will move on to the next thing. So, campaign history. Who are we and why did we get started? So I'm from Defend Glendale Public Housing Coalition. We got started in 2014 when Levin Youssef, who's the current director of Defend Glendale Public Housing Coalition and a current Glendale Townhomes resident, was door knocking in Prospect Park, and a Prospect Park homeowner said, "Hey, don't worry about what you're door knocking about. You should be worried about the privatization of your own homes." And my mom was like, "What?" Levin's my mom. My mom was like, "What do you mean the privatization of my own homes?" And she called, she did some research. She figured out that MPHA was actually pursuing RAD at Glendale, and she called Cam Gordon, and Cam Gordon, who is our city councilor, was like, "Oh yeah, I'm sorry you had to find out this way." So that was his response, which I think also speaks to the just patheticness of city council's response to privatization and their just complicitness and their complacency in the privatization of public housing in general. But after that, Glendale 11 joined the Glendale Resident Council, and they tried to use the Resident Council to advocate against RAD, but then they were shut down at every single corner. So everybody at the Glendale Resident Council quit, and Defend Glendale was started that way. They quit the Resident Council and they said, no, we're just going to form our own thing. And then they formed Defend Glendale. And then in 2015, Defend Glendale campaign stopped the RAD vote at City Hall. So they prevented the RAD vote from even occurring, because I should probably say that the reason why there has been no vote at RAD in regards to Elliott Twins is because they are not demolishing RAD. They're not demolishing Elliott Twins. They're just transferring the ownership. MPHA wanted to, at first, just demolish Glendale, and that's why they needed city approval to demolish Glendale. But then they learned from their mistake and decided to work around city approval and just transfer ownership, which they don't need city approval for. But anyways, Glendale residents stopped the RAD vote at City Hall. That would have led to the demolition of Glendale townhomes. And then they thought, we're done. This is the end of the organization. But it turned out that Sherman and Associates, which is like $1 billion group that is really famous for owning most of Cedar Riverside, came up with a proposal to buy up Glendale, lease the land, and build condos and demolish Glendale. And so that's when our organization was revitalized. And then after that, we found out that not only were they trying to get rid of Glendale townhomes, but they were trying to get rid of all the public housing when Greg Russ came into his position as the executive director. And so that's how we changed our name from Defend Glendale to Defend Glendale Public Housing Coalition, because then we started to work with other public housing residents. And now we work with public housing residents from all the different scattered sites all across the city, and I think maybe 17 different buildings, high rises. So we have a really strong coalition of public housing residents from all across the city that we work with now. And how do we organize? Our campaign is resident-led, and we constantly have meetings with residents. This has been a little bit more difficult since the pandemic began, but we are still meeting and reaching out to residents, and that's how we organize this coming press conference. And our primary strategies are rallies, calls to action, and we try to and our biggest tool is disrupting MPHA's process through the use of research. We research all the policies that they propose, and then we create fact sheets, and we translate those fact sheets into Somali, Oromo, and Hmong, so that they are accessible to all of our residents. And we also, prior to the pandemic, would go and meet with residents and explain information to residents on their own so that they could decide how to advocate for themselves. And we also tried to get media coverage. Like local white media really doesn't like to cover us and actually doesn't favor us. Particularly the Star Tribune has written some really gross things about us. So we focus on immigrant and international media to amplify our voices. And we do a lot of research, like I said earlier, research formulating fact sheets and translating those fact sheets. And then we also do a lot of lobbying and try to pressure elected officials at City Hall and the state government to act. And now we build allies through education like this. So this is also part of our organizing. But yeah, funding. Before I get to funding, are there any questions? Am I going too fast?
We don't have any questions that have not already been answered in the chat, and we're at 7 o'clock, so I think you're right on schedule.
Normally this takes so much longer. So I'm like, am I missing something? I don't know.
Oh, Dominique adds, what are ways that other progressive groups can uplift your demands at the Capitol?
Well, we're going to get to that. We have a list of asks at the end. So thank you, Dominique, for asking that. But yes, we do need a lot of people to uplift our demands because it's not just a few of us anymore. This is getting rid the privatization of public housing all across the city is going to change the way that the city of Minneapolis looks like, particularly the scattered sites. There are 700 scattered sites all over the city of Minneapolis, with the majority of them being in North Minneapolis. And you may not know that there are scattered sites in your neighborhood, but once they turn into duplexes and fourplexes, you're going to notice how quickly Minneapolis changes. So I totally agree that different groups need to be supporting our work, but also understanding the massive scale of this. But yes, funding. Does privatization have to happen? My answer is no. Historically, funding for public housing has declined in favor of programs like the low-income housing tax credit. But in the last 2 years, funding has actually increased a little bit. In 2018, the capital fund for public housing was increased by 42% with the 2018 Omnibus Spending Bill, and in 2019, HUD's funding for public housing operation was increased only by 2.3%, but it is most significant that it wasn't decreased. MPHA's argument is that funding for public housing is consistently decreasing. And although that may be true historically, that hasn't been true the last few years, especially the years that they have been pushing these programs. So it's really important to combat those narratives like, you may not have as much money as you used to, but you do have money, It's not as if you have been dramatically defunded. But because of this funding increase that they received in 2018, MPHA created a program called the Quality Maintenance Program, QMP, to improve the maintenance, rehabilitation, and repair work in public housing sites. So the question is, if MPHA created this Quality Maintenance Program to maintain and rehabilitate public housing, why do they need to implement RAD LH wins in Section 18 at their scattered sites to fund repairs and rehab if they already have this program and they already have the funding necessary for this program? Their funding increase allowed them to implement QMP at Glendale, where I live, but it never happened. And at LH Wins with a planned expansion to the rest of public housing property citywide. And this program, though widely touted, was not completed, And actually, recently, Glendale residents had a meeting with MPHA leadership and Mary Bowler, the director of public housing at MPHA, and she said that actually the reason why they haven't completed this program at Glendale is because they're diverting some of these QMP funds to their privatization measures in other properties. So the money that they received from the government to maintain and rehabilitate these properties, they're actually using to fund their privatization initiatives, which is something else, but it is what's happening. And so the next question is public housing really crumbling? Because if you talk to, Lisa Bender or Lisa Goodman even, they'll probably say that public housing in the city of Minneapolis is debilitated. But they haven't actually visited any public housing, if they say that, because in Minneapolis, public housing consistently gets 98 out of 100 ratings from federal HUD inspections, and Minneapolis has some of the best public housing in that respect. PHAs, including MPHA, have neglected their housing as an entryway into privatization, and this is called demolition by neglect. So if you go to New York, or if you go to some places elsewhere in the country, public housing is really this can be really dysfunctional, but Minneapolis has amazing public housing. So when city councilors and MPHA and other elected officials talk about the way that public housing in the city of Minneapolis is debilitated and needs rehabilitation, it desperately needs rehabilitation, it's really important to recognize that that language is actually coded and has is racist. It has racial implications because the majority of people that live in public housing are Black, And the thing is, you can also get away with saying that to people who have never been to public housing, because most people who don't live in public housing and who aren't poor, don't have a relationship with what public housing is or know what public housing looks like, But it's really important to interrogate that sort of agenda and understand, no. HUD says that Minneapolis has some of the best public housing in the country, and if HUD evaluates MPHA and gives them 98 out of 100s, then why are our elected officials telling us that it's debilitated and it needs to be immediately rehabbed? It's all racist. Like I said earlier, being anti-public housing is an anti-Black stance, and a lot of this privatization is steeped in anti-Black racism. So yeah. This figure is from, I think, 2 years ago, and so some of MPHA's estimated needs have increased during this time, but I really like using this figure, even though it's a little bit old, because it demonstrates that MPHA has access to funds that they have not used. So MPHA 2 years ago said that they needed $25 million in estimated capital needs. I think that number is now 37 million. It's important to note that MPHA has never been independently evaluated or audited, so we have no idea how much these figures have been inflated. How did it go from 25 million to 37 million in a year and a half? I don't know, and that's one of our asks, that MPHA is independently audited, but they have not used city levies that they have access to, state levies that they have access to, capital funding from HUD that they have access to. The truth is that MPHA also has $23 million surplus that they say that they are holding on to in the case of emergencies. And we thought, isn't COVID an emergency? They can use this money in the meantime to take care of, They can use this money in the meantime to take care of, to stop the privatization of public housing during, a pandemic, a global pandemic, but they also have decided not to touch this money in the meantime. So I think it's really important to note that they have access to a lot of federal and state funding, in addition to a $23 million surplus that they have not used. And it's really important to note this, because they are saying that they are out of money, and that's not the entire truth. And the thing is also, MPHA is the largest public housing authority in the state, and if they went to the state and said, yeah, we need money, I'm sure the state would give it to them. So they haven't even applied for state levies. So yeah, MPHA can afford to keep its public housing public, they just don't have the will to keep their public housing public. So MPHA in the city. Actually, there was something I wanted to talk about before. What was it? Oh, sorry to go back really quick, but when we talk about demolition by neglect, I think I flew by this a little bit too quickly. I live in Glendale Townhomes, and before MPHA proposed RAD at Glendale in 2015, MPHA did no capital repairs or maintenance for 5 years. And this is actually a phenomenon, demolition by neglect, that's happening across mid-sized cities and in their public housing authorities across the country, in other smaller cities like St. Louis, where public housing authorities are intentionally neglecting their public housing in an effort to make a case for privatization. But I just wanted to make sure that's clear, that I'm not just saying, oh, demolition by neglect happens, but it actually happened. I live in Glendale Townhomes, and we did not have insulation, and we did not have capital maintenance repairs for 5 years. And the reason why we have all of that now is because of the advocacy and organizing of our group. But yeah, okay. MPHA and the city. In the 90s, MPHA was a department of the city, and then they developed into their own entity under HUD's Federal Moving to Work program. The city of Minneapolis still has a level of oversight and control over MPHA. So this is important, because if you talk to people at the city of Minneapolis, they will say MPHA is a different thing. We don't have any jurisdiction over them. We don't have control over them. That's why we haven't had a vote. That's why we're not telling them what to do. This is not true. MPHA has been and is obligated to report quarterly to the city council. The mayor and city council have the authority under Chapter 420 not only to appoint, but to remove the commissioners they've appointed with or without cause. So if they wanted to, they could just say, hey, all the people at MPHA, they're trying to privatize public housing. We're not for public housing. We're not for the privatization of public housing. We're just going to fire all of them. They could say that, but they haven't. And the 1980 special law dictates that the city can put limits on MPHA and its power by ordinance. So if the city council was really about it, today they could write an ordinance that says no public housing is going to be privatized in the city of Minneapolis. But they haven't done that, you know? So one of the things that I always like to tell people when they're advocating for public housing in the city, with their city councilors, with the mayor, with their state reps, is that actually no, MPHA has oversight over the city of Minneapolis, and it's not oversight. The city of Minneapolis has oversight over MPHA, my bad, and that the city of Minneapolis can change and influence what MPHA does. It's not a matter of, oh, there's no relationship, because that's not true. MPHA's former executive director, Greg Russ. Before I get to Greg Russ, are there any questions? No? Okay. MPHA's former executive director, Greg Russ. Greg Russ is the person who introduced Section 18 and RAD at LA Twins and all of the major privatization schemes that are currently occurring at MPHA several years ago. It is important to understand who Greg Russ is if you just want to know about public housing in general, because I'm not sure how many of you know what Cabrini Green is, but he was one of the HUD officials that was responsible for the privatization of Cabrini Green in Chicago. He was also a HUD official responsible for a lot of the demolition and privatization of Detroit public housing, and he was the deputy director of Philadelphia's public housing authority when Philadelphia privatized a lot of their public housing. I remember I was teaching one of these workshops, and one of the people who came to the workshop told me that she grew up in Philly, and that after public housing was privatized in Philadelphia, the entire school system changed, because all the children who went to certain schools, a lot of Black children who went to certain schools in Philadelphia were no longer able to, because they were pushed out of those neighborhoods, and people had to reorganize the entire school district. And she told me how stressful it was for her as a youth growing up through that. But that's going to happen here in Minneapolis, you know? So he also, before he came to Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, he was in charge of Cambridge, Massachusetts Public Housing Authority, and he got rid of all of Cambridge's public housing. They have no public housing now. So he became the director of MPHA in February of 2017, following longtime executive director Cora McCorvey retiring, and the entire city council voted to confirm him as executive director. Our entire progressive city council voted to confirm him, despite his history and his record. And council member Lisa Goodman was responsible for bringing him in. And in a 2015 article in the Cambridge Day, highlighted a pay increase for Greg Russ, and it revealed that on top of his nearly $200,000 salary, his contract with Cambridge Public Housing Authority allowed for him to work up to 80 hours a year as a private contractor, which is very scammy. I also like to say that in order to really understand why Greg Russ was doing all of this, he once testified in front of Congress and said that he considered it his life's calling to privatize public housing. He considered it a calling to privatize public housing. He believed that all housing should be in the private market. And also, one of the other things that I always like to tell people, especially socialists, so it's good that we're on this call, is that he worked for Apt Associates in the 90s, which was a CIA contractor that did disinformation work for the CIA in Chile. So he has a long history of not only privatizing public housing, but doing misinformation campaigns and a lot of other stuff. And he's just generally a bad guy. He moved from MPHA last summer to NYCHA, which is New York City's Public Housing Authority, and he got a $200,000 pay increase. So now, instead of making $200,000 like he did here, he makes $400,000 in New York City, which I think is he makes more money than the president makes. Yeah, bad guy. I feel like the chat is going crazy. Were there any questions about him?
We have a few comments. Let's see. So Amy says that she's from Chicago, lived near the last of Cabrini Green before it was torn down in 2009. There's a huge mall shopping area now, and it's super expensive to live. And Tim agreed with Amy and said that it was surrounded by rapidly gentrifying areas and treated like an inconvenience. And then, yeah, that there was also a lot of misinformation to defend Glendale and turn a lot of people against the movement. So the CIA connection, I just said OMG, because that is crazy.
It is
Not
crazy.
know that.
He worked for Apps. People should look up Apt Associates. They did a lot of really crazy work. But yeah, it's important to note that about the misinformation, because that's one of MPHA's biggest things, is gaslighting both residents and the media and saying that like everything that we're saying is a lie. They can do this because they were taught to do this by Greg Russ, who had a career in this with the CIA. So yeah. Greg Russ is generally a scammy guy, but another thing that's really important to note about Greg Russ and why he really wanted to go ahead and privatize Minneapolis public housing is because he had an interest in it. His wife and his father-in-law are both owners and like officers of Kenneth Talley, Thies and Talley, which is one of the biggest affordable housing firms and developers in the state of Minnesota. And so the privatization of public housing in Minneapolis would have directly benefited his family. And this was a letter that was written from a public housing resident to MPHA, not to MPHA, to HUD, to Jacob Fry, to the city council, and to Star Tribune. And you know what happened after this letter was written? Nothing happened. Greg Russ left because he got a pay raise and not because he was outed for having a massive conflict of interest in the privatization of public housing. So yeah. Whew. Other MPHA things. This is where I think it gets a little bit more interesting, lighter, because we're done talking about privatization. But opportunity atlas mapping. This is a part of the presentation where I'd like to have it be a little bit more interactive. So on page 7 of 2020 of the 2020 MTW annual plan, which is the MPHA's annual report, MPHA is normalizing gentrification and racism via their newest plan. Greg Russ and MPHA partnered with Dr. Raj Chetty of Harvard University, and he authored a national map called Atlas Mapping, which outlines how to gentrify urban cities. So the quote is, "We now have data and an economic map, new geography that is rich with opportunities for families and their children. Our task is to apply this information to the programs we administer and determine what best factors help families make a move and sustain a move. This means that us and MPHA want to push families out of their traditional communities by targeting and gentrifying wards 4, 5, 6, 8, and 9. They've identified these wards as low opportunity areas and white suburbs as high opportunity areas. The racial coding here is very clear, and this is a part of a long tradition of redlining and demonizing Black and brown neighborhoods so developers can take over and gentrify. So basically the way that this works is if you're a public housing resident and you live in one of these areas and you've demonstrated a desire to move, they will give you a Section 8 voucher to move into one of the high opportunity areas. But it's very, very clear what areas are high opportunity and what areas are low opportunity, particularly because they create these maps using both racial and wealth concentrations. So like predominantly Black areas are considered low opportunity because they're highly racially concentrated, but white neighborhoods are not considered low opportunity because they're racially concentrated, because, you know, whiteness is neutral. So I always like to demonstrate this by actually coming up with it. By actually putting it into the, can somebody put, 1 second, here's what we're gonna do.
Try right clicking on it.
Yeah, I was wondering, can somebody actually put their thing in the chat, their like an address of any kind, and I'm gonna put that address into the map and I'll show you how the map works. Does everybody see this map?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. So begin exploring. This map is super racist. I'm excited for y'all to see it. So red is low opportunity and blue, green is high opportunity. So this area that you put in Miami is considered median opportunity, and basically they use incarceration rates of the neighborhood, income, and racial concentrations to determine this. So this is medium, but if you go a little bit left to the, is that the right? That is red. And if you see Whittier over here, it's like all red. And Whittier is predominantly a neighborhood of color, but this particular area isn't as much, so it is tan. Does everybody see that difference? Okay, I'm gonna put in a different address. A few blocks away, it's very blue. This is considered extremely high opportunity. Tim, you live in the middle though. Okay, so I just want to sort of demonstrate there's like several different reasons why this happens, why this is important for MPHA. It's because first, they can sort of say that they are getting people out of poor neighborhoods and stopping the cycle of poverty. That's not the way that it works. But also it's because they can use this to strategically identify which public housing properties to privatize, because low opportunity areas for their residents are high opportunity areas for developers and investors. Does that make sense? It's like twofold. They're performing like this notion of protecting and public housing residents from poverty, but in actuality, they're prepping public housing properties for development by investors and developers. I'm going to put in one more address, and then we can move on to the next thing. But I just always like using this map because I think people usually get shocked at how blatant it is. I remember during one of my workshops previously, somebody put in a East Side St. Paul map, not an East Side St. Paul map, an East Side St. Paul address. And so one neighborhood was red and it was black, and it made like the average income was $32,000. And the next neighborhood, which was white, the average income was $34,000, only $2,000 more, and it was blue. So it's like really blatant. 4th Street, Minneapolis. Okay, here we go. So this area is light blue, but to the left of it is red. And here's Sumner and Glenwood. This is where Heritage Park is, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But yeah, to the left and north of it, it's very red, but this area is blue. So do people see that? This area is the North Loop. Do people see that? How blatant that is? Okay, I feel like we can move on from this segment, but I just want to make sure that people understand how extreme this is. I'll go on to the next. We only have 2 slides left, so. So yeah, let's talk about Heritage Park. Oh, okay. Heritage Park. So Heritage Park is a mix of public housing and affordable housing in the Sumner Glenwood neighborhood, which was formerly Sumner Glenwood Homes, and was formerly a really large public housing project in the 90s, but was privatized using Hope 6. But in 2020, MPHA will begin a master planning process. This is from their own report, so these are their exact words, potentially including a choice neighborhoods planning grant to craft our long-term vision of the Heritage Park neighborhood, where MPHA has an extensive presence. This neighborhood faces growth and change as the construction of the Blue Line light rail transit extension commences. MPHA owns approximately 14 acres of vacant land in the Heritage Park development and will continue to monitor market conditions and development opportunities to develop these parcels at the fullest and to the fullest at the appropriate time. So this is really blatant. If you all see this, MPHA is a public housing authority. Their primary concern should be with housing the poorest people in our city, not monitoring market conditions to figure out when is the best time to develop their vacant acres. But if you watch this video, I'm not sure if this video will play, but let me know if you all can hear it, okay? But is this appearing for everybody? If you watch this video,
it looks like it's not playing yet still.
okay. So if you watch this video, this is Greg Russ talking about his plans for what he wants to develop at Heritage Park's 14 vacant acres. So I'm gonna play it and let me know in the chat if it's working. In this video, Greg Russ introduces the term workforce housing, which he defines as housing meant for those who make between 80 to 120% of their area median income, or $80,000 to $120,000. In MPHA's newly released 2020 MTW draft plan, MPHA's annual report to HUD, MPHA states that they intend to create workforce housing at Heritage Park, but failed to include its definition: housing for those who make between $80,000 to $120,000 a year in income. Here's the clip where he gives this definition.
We can't hear it.
People aren't hearing? Okay. I'm not sure if I thought my, 1 second. I thought it was sharing my, okay. Well, here's what I can do. You know what I can do? I feel like I'm not going to be able to share my sound audio, but it's okay. I'm going to put the link in the chat. There I go. And everybody can watch it on their own. But basically this link describes the video in this link. It shows him talking about how workforce housing, which you would think is for working class people, is actually housing that is designed for people that make between 80 to 120% of AMI every year, which is really shocking because MPHA should be developing housing for those who cannot afford to live anywhere else in the market, not for people who can comfortably afford housing in the market. But this sort of, I feel like, gives an entry into MPHA's sort of approach to housing. They are not operating as though they are a public housing authority where they are investing in and creating new public housing for poor people. They are interested in selling off and developing housing for people who can afford it comfortably in the market already to make as much money as possible. That's the only reason why they would be sitting on 14 acres of land and monitoring market conditions rather than just developing public housing on it. But this is just to emphasize how much public land MPHA has that they haven't disclosed and that they're not doing anything with it. The final slide, like this is one of the last two slides, is that the Fair Class Amendment, which I hope some of you have heard about. There's been a lot of talk about it in the news recently because a repeal of the Fair Class Amendment passed the House. I don't think it's passed the Senate yet. The Fair Class Amendment was added onto the Housing Act of 1937 by Bill Clinton in the 90s. And it stated that HUD cannot fund the construction of new public housing units unless to replace old or lost units. So this is a part of the reason why funding for public housing has decreased for decades, because once this amendment was installed, public housing authorities could no longer make new public housing, and that's why the federal government slowed funding to public housing authorities, and then it became the cycle of like, oh, I don't have any money, I can't make new public housing, you don't need money because you're not making new public housing, and it became a cycle that was started by Bill Clinton. So, but on page 59 of the 2020 annual plan, MPHA revealed that they are excluded from this rule as an MTW agency because of the deregulation that they have. MPHA stated that under HUD's fair clause limit, the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority has the authority to operate additional public housing units over its current stock and receive additional subsidy for the units. So MPHA is one of, I think, 37 or was it 47? 37 housing authorities in the country that has the authorization to build new public housing units. This is significant. We have a major crisis with homelessness. You know, we have a lot of people who are not going to be able to afford living in the city. You know, like MPHA is one of the few public housing authorities that can build new public housing, and not only can it build new public housing without federal approval, it has the land to do so. You know, so it's already clear that RAD and Section 18 conversions will lead to a loss of around 1,216 units, and that this will be more expensive for residents and for MPHA. But furthermore, MPHA already has vacant land, access to untapped city and state levies, like we talked about earlier, in addition to a hefty surplus. And if they really wanted to, if MPHA was an agency that moved with the concern of poor people in its heart rather than concerns of profit, they could develop new public housing. And that's what our organization's main ask is. We obviously want to prevent the privatization of all public housing because it harms public housing residents, and we truly believe that the imminent homelessness and displacement of public housing residents, especially disabled and elderly public housing residents, can lead to like extreme health issues and also death for like a lot, like it's a combination to death, I feel like. But also one of our organization's main asks is that we build more public housing in the city, because if people cannot afford housing, you just give them a unit, you know? There's no need to sort of negotiate what AMI, all these different like eligibility processes. Public housing is really unique because it just says, okay, here's housing, pay as much as you can or don't pay anything, you know? And that's why we need more of it. So next steps, how to support our work. This is the last slide. You can attend our press conference for Elliott Twins residents this Saturday, online or in person, denouncing the sale of Elliott Twins to Royal Bank of Canada. You can sign and send an email through our letter campaign. You can advocate for public housing and push your elected representatives and candidates to be anti-privatization and to expand public housing. When people talk about the need for housing and affordable housing in the city of Minneapolis, stop using the word affordable, because like I demonstrated earlier, affordability is very loose and it can mean a lot of different things and mostly means money for developers. Push for public housing and income-based housing. Push for public housing to be used, not just affordable housing. And if you don't live in Minneapolis, you can find out more about the public housing where you live. There's definitely organizing happening, like in St. Paul. St. Paul Public Housing Authority is privatizing 8 of their high-rises using RAD, Rental Assistance Administration. So if you live in St. Paul, there's organizing to be done there. You can volunteer to support our mutual aid efforts. I didn't really get an opportunity to talk about it, but we have an amazing mutual aid campaign called Public Goods, which I am so excited for. I think it's the coolest thing ever, where we are giving COVID-19 supplies and gift cards to scattered site residents all across the city of Minneapolis, over 900 households, and we are directly redistributing $30,000 to over 900 public housing households. I think it's so cool. It's really dope. And we need volunteers for that. So if you want to join our efforts for that and distribute COVID-19 supplies to public housing residents, you can always let us know. You can stay in touch and amplify our work, and also donate if you have money to our general fund so that we can continue to do our work, since we are a small resident-led organization. But yeah, that is the main stuff of this. Now is the opportunity to have questions and talk backs. I think we still have half an hour left to discuss more about public housing. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and we can all talk about it.
Tim had a great question in the chat. Is there a way to reclaim MPHA to build more public housing? And how do we push faux progressive electeds to do that?
Yeah, I mean, pushing faux progressive electives, that's difficult because, you know, like people like Abdi Wadasame is now the head of Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, who's a former city councilor. He ran on public housing. He told all of the public housing residents in his ward, like, I'm down for public housing, I grew up in public housing, you don't have to worry about it. And now he's the executive director of MPHA and leading the privatization. You know, same with Andrea Jenkins. She met with public housing residents when she was running, and then signed and supported a resolution that sort of like supported the conversion of public housing. So it's really difficult for us to understand like how to put pressure on these local electeds who it's just really difficult for us. But even like Ilhan Omar, like she made this huge bill about public housing nationally, Homes for All, and she has not said a single thing about the privatization of public housing in her own district. So it's not just about pushing our electeds. I think it's just about getting new ones, because none of them are about what they say they're about, and none of them really have any care or concern for the well-being of poor people in their that they represent. So yeah, that's just a really big thing. But yeah, would you mind defining what, if any, is the distinction between houselessness and homelessness? I don't really think there is any distinction. I think houselessness is just a term that is used to provide more dignity to people who are unsheltered. A lot of people have been pushing to use the word houselessness as opposed to homelessness, because just because people are unsheltered does not mean that they don't have homes or communities that they belong to. So that's really all it is, to my understanding. Mary, somebody raised their hand.
Hi, thanks so much. This is really informative. I really learned a lot. I have a question. You mentioned the 2040 plan as sort of an outcome, like increased density as an outcome to the privatization of public housing.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious if the 2040 plan has any sort of provisions or anything to be optimistic about when it comes to public housing.
It does not.
Okay.
I can say that with confidence. Okay, so the first few drafts of the 2040 plan did not even include the words public housing. Okay, so it's really important to note that when the city was coming up with their plan for the next 20 years, what Minneapolis was going to look like, they had no intention to include public housing in their vision of the future. Okay, because they didn't see public housing as in their vision. And in fact, public housing residents protested at numerous 2040 meetings, and that's how we even got the words public housing in the 2040 plan. But actually, it's really important to note how, if we go back to the letter that I showed all of you earlier that Jacob Fry and Lisa Bender signed, that invokes the 2040 plan and says and it talks about the connection between Section 18 and the 2040 plan. One of the things that 2040 plan advocates for is increased density through the development of fourplexes and triplexes. And how do you think those are going to happen, right? It's through the redevelopment of scattered-site single-family homes that are being privatized through Section 18. So not only does like the 2040 plan sort of ignore public housing at large, it also is one of the mechanisms through which they plan on redeveloping these scattered-site homes that have been privatized. If the city is selling these buildings for $1, is there any way the residents themselves... This is such a good question. Okay, thank you, Hope, for asking this. So the truth is, one of the big things with Section 18, federally, like the way that this program is operated through HUD, is that PHAs, MPHA included, have the option to offer these homes to sell to residents prior to selling them off to developers. That's one of the things that is included in the function of the program. So many other public housing authorities across the country have gone through with this, say, oh, well, if you're a resident, you can decide if you want to buy your home before we sell it off, okay? But MPHA refused to provide that option to public housing residents. I know I've met with multiple Section 18 residents who said that they would have preferred to buy these homes rather than have them sold underneath them. But the truth is, MPHA, when asked why they didn't provide the option to buy these homes for residents, they said, oh, these homes are going to be affordable housing anyway, so we don't see what the big deal is. You know, they have no intention of including residents at any point in their process. And this is just a way to signify sort of the callousness and the casual cruelty that they have towards the residents that they house, you know, but they never had any intention of allowing residents to sell the homes to residents, even though like that's something that happens historically. But I appreciate that question. Thank you for allowing me to bring that up. Anybody else have anything? We can like turn our mics on and talk. We have like a half hour left.
Yeah, I'm curious. So we have the Keep Public Housing Public Coalition. Are there opportunities for, I'm pretty sure there are people on this call who are associated with, I don't know, maybe a grassroots organizing group. Are there opportunities for additional groups to sign on to the coalition? How would that work?
Yeah, I mean, we are always asking for people to join and support our work. If you want to get involved with us, you just have to reach out to us. All of our contact information is on our website, but also I think hopefully we can link to talk afterwards about sending a follow-up email to all the people who signed on to the call and giving out all the information. But yeah, we are always accepting supporters. We have a huge Keep Public Housing Public Coalition, so if you are in an organization, you are totally invited to come and join us. We have a lot of neighborhood organizations that are a part of our coalition. The Northside Neighborhood Council, which includes all of the neighborhood organizations in North Minneapolis, have joined our coalition and have sent in letters to elected officials denouncing the privatization of homes in their neighborhoods. So we encourage people to join.
You've done a terrific job, just terrific. Thank you so much. This is such important information, and you've presented it so well.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
One thing, because I know that DSA has done a lot with Defend Glendale, but I'm not as familiar with kind of like what I know until like recently with the most recent privatization. That was like the first time that like privatization has gone through. But like, what is kind of like Defend Glendale's like theory of change? Like what, like Defend Glendale does an excellent job of like raising consciousness and like pushing back and bringing a lot of publicity. And I didn't know, like, do you have a vision for like longer strategy? Which yeah, I just want to hear more about it.
I think like something that's always important to note about our organization is that it's resident led, you know, and that like our most immediate concerns are not being displaced. You know, I live in Glendale townhomes, so I know that if Elliott Twins gets privatized successfully, MPHA has already listed Glendale townhomes as one of the properties that they want to place next, like prioritize next, you know, and I don't want to be homeless. I don't want to be homeless again, you know? So one of our biggest concerns is the immediacy of privatization as public housing residents, but our long-term vision and strategy, which we just haven't been able to advocate for effectively because we've been so like overwhelmed by the privatization that's been happening to us in our communities, is for the development and investment of an expansion of public housing throughout the city of Minneapolis. Public housing is the end-all be-all solution to homelessness. If somebody is unsheltered, just give them a place to live. It's not that hard, you know? And public housing is the mechanism in the United States to do that. So that's why we want to build more public housing. We know that MPHA not only has the money to, they're sitting on this massive surplus, but they also have the land to do it. They have so many empty acres of land throughout the city of Minneapolis. It's not really a matter of resources, it's a matter of will. And like, it's just not of interest to anybody at the city level to do that. And you know that it's not, because they're pushing affordable housing funds, which are partnerships with developers, rather than investments in their own public housing authority, you know? But that's one of our biggest things. After we get rid of privatization, we want more public housing. And then our organization is going to be done. Once we get a law that says Minneapolis will build more public housing, then we're done with our work. That's all.
Yeah. Like, I know, sorry for editorializing, like a lot of the time we're thinking like immediate, like you said, like short term, kind of like the things that are attacking you every day. And so I think it's really like hopeful to share with people like what the long-term vision is and exactly what you're saying, like housing as a human right and providing that, and especially thinking about that as the Twin Cities DSA plug in terms of like all the area that is under risk for gentrification around the High Lake area where the protests were.
And I see Empoya said in the chat, can you talk about empty units? So MPHA actually has a lot of empty units, and that one thing that's really important to note is that they need, especially in Elliott Twins, they need vacant units in order to successfully privatize the homes due to their relocation strategies. So one of the things that we've been pushing for since COVID-19 happened is that the city immediately rehouse unsheltered people in shelters and outside in the vacant units that MPHA has. MPHA has vacant single family homes and apartment units and all this other stuff, because not only does that mean that people are housed currently and are at lower risk of contracting COVID and being out in this ridiculous heat, but it also means that they can't move forward with their privatization schemes because they need vacant units to do their relocation plans. So that's one of the big things that we've been advocating for too, and that's a part of our letter campaign. Yeah. Anybody else have anything to say? Does anybody have any experience with public housing? Any ideas about what public housing should be like? I saw somebody talked earlier about public housing in Europe. Vienna has amazing public housing. I've read about it. I've never been there. But anybody have any other ideas or things to share about public housing?
Yeah, like I've been looking into some exemplary public housing system around the world, and Singapore keeps coming up. I believe in Singapore,
80%.
over 72, yeah,
Yes.
72 and 80% are public housing. And they also have a system where tenants have the opportunity to purchase. So their home ownership is also rating is really high as well.
Singapore is amazing.
And then also, it's amazing. And also I have family who live in Okinawa, Japan, and there has been conversations where they're forcing the Okinawan prefecture to essentially seize vacant, like livable vacant residential units, and then turning them into public housing units to to bring in tenants. And then after a couple of years, give the tenants the opportunity to turn into a housing cooperative. It would be like run by the tenants. So there are like many modes of public housing that I think are worth exploring, different like hybrids between public housing cooperatives. So yeah, so I recommend everyone to do some research on public housing that exists outside of the United States, and see like how we can potentially like introduce that here to Minneapolis or in the US broadly. There are two people who have their hands raised. Mary?
Yeah, thank you. I know that historic preservation has played a role in like the ongoing Defend Glendale conversation. But I'm curious I guess I don't really understand how being a protected historic property would relate to Section 18. And I'm wondering if you know anything about that.
Yeah, so historic preservation was one of the things that was sort of promoted and publicized, proposed by Prospect Park homeowners and Prospect Park residents, and also Camp Gordon, as a response to the initial proposal to convert Glendale to RAD a few years ago. And so basically something to get clear is that Glendale Townhomes is technically a scattered site, but Glendale Townhomes are not being privatized under Section 18 currently, Since the proposal for RAD happened in 2015, 2014, there's been an ongoing push to pursue historic preservation at Glendale Townhomes, because Glendale Townhomes is really historical. First of all, it's the last public housing project in the city of Minneapolis. There used to be several, and the last one was privatized in the 90s at Heritage, which is now Heritage Park. So it's the last public housing project in the city of Minneapolis, but also it was created in the 40s to house war vets that were coming back from World War II. So there's a lot of historical parts about that, but it doesn't really relate to Section 18 at all. It was just an effort by Prospect Park residents and by Camp Gordon to protect Glendale. But it did, I think for us, for our campaign, we're pushing for that because it would protect Glendale from privatization, but also it's not a policy platform that we can push generally speaking, because not all public housing is like eligible for historic preservation. We just want to say it doesn't matter if it's historically relevant or important to the city, public housing shouldn't be privatized, period. Yeah. Somebody else has raised their hand.
763 number, who is that? Reveal yourself.
Oh. I just wanted Kyle to talk about the seizing of like how we're planning to work with the units or vacant units that have been that were used, taxpayers' money were used to build, and then how there a lot of them are sitting empty right now.
Oh yeah, we can talk about that after this
Okay.
person that raised their hand. The 763 number. Did somebody want to raise their? Did you want to talk? Okay.
Sorry, is that me?
Yeah, that's you.
Oh, okay, cool. I was like I didn't know if I correctly unmuted myself. I was gonna say, in regards to like when you all were talking about like Singapore and public housing, so initially the reason was because from what I understand, I have like a very basic understanding. It was because the government, obviously the government at that point in time, the country was developing. Some people might use the term third world country. I don't really agree with that term, and I don't like the connotation it has, but it was a developing country at the time. And the government realized that in order to increase the overall GDP and increase the wealth of the entire country and create like good, like stable racial ties between like all the various ethnicities in the country, they would need to create stable housing, and through like housing grants and long-term leases and having housing be a public, like the housing authority was like always a public entity. It was like never privatized and it's not allowed. It would create like, so it would allow for like social mobility, if that makes sense, in comparison to like the UK, where it's like the system is very similar to the US. And if anything, it's actually a lot worse. Like estates is like what they call public housing in the UK. It's like the system there is like just very different, obviously, but like, yeah, it's like not good in comparison to like if you go to like Denmark or you go to like the Netherlands and relative to like the UK or like France.
Thank you, Fatah. I recognize your voice. But thank you for that contribution. But before I answer Jen's question, I'm just going to speak to what Levin said about one of the things I forgot to mention is one of our new policy platforms, speaking to your question, Rita, is that we are advocating that all vacant and empty units that have been developed using low-income housing tax credits, affordable fund grants, and different subsidies, that taxpayer money that are sitting empty, vacant, which a lot of them are in the city of Minneapolis, that they immediately be seized by the city of Minneapolis and operated as public housing by MPHA. So that's one of our big asks now, because we have a huge amount of houselessness in the city of Minneapolis, like ridiculous. There's so many people that are suffering. And there's also a huge amount of vacant properties that have been developed using taxpayer money that are just sitting empty, sitting and waiting until the market is right or whatever. So we are saying, no more. Taxpayers should not be funding vacant luxury apartments. We're not going to do that. Let's have the city of Minneapolis seize these vacant units and operate them as public housing, and immediately fill them with people coming from shelters and outside. So that's one of our bigger policy platforms now that I forgot to mention earlier. But Jen asked, how can you elaborate on how neighborhood orgs can collaborate or participate? So yeah, we have neighborhood organizations like the Northside Neighborhood Council and also Prospect Park Neighborhood Association that have collaborated with us, that have supported our work. And they've done that through writing letters on behalf of their organizations, denouncing the privatization of public housing in their neighborhoods, but also through having conversations with public housing residents in their neighborhoods and explaining to them what's happening to their housing, meeting with different elected officials who represent their neighborhoods. And so I think it's really important to note that like a lot of public, like I showed you all the map earlier, but of how many different public housing, single family homes are all across the city. Lots of these neighborhood organizations do not engage with the amount of public housing residents that live in their neighborhood. They're not even aware of it, you know? So one of the main things is building awareness. Like you have public housing residents in your neighborhood, and if they leave, it will dramatically shape and change the way that your neighborhood looks like, you know what I mean? So that's one of the main things. And then getting them involved with our campaign and saying, we can't be doing privatization. It's not good for the city, but also it's not good for our residents. So yeah, if you want to join our coalition, just reach out to us.
And I just wanted to add, I don't know how to raise my hand here. Sorry. I just wanted to add that there's just this thing about a lot of this. We have experienced two things. One is that a lot, maybe now it's changing, but I'm not sure. But there's when Greg Russ put that whole campaign out on us to try to the disinformation, which is kind of the same tactics he used before. A lot of there are a lot of homeowners that are sitting on these neighborhood organizations, especially in South Minneapolis, that don't really care about Black and brown people or low-income people that are being gentrified, and they will listen to the city. So the city and Greg Russ and MPHA have the same narrative. This is not true. What they're saying is not true. We will never displace people, even though everything that they're saying in their report says that. So that's one. So the neighborhood organizations that are right now trying to play both sides haven't been with us. The Northside Neighborhood Group, though, but our united front, because they've been fighting the city as a united front with all the displacement and the gentrification that the city has had, and also their budget cuts that they faced. And then somebody talked about Cam Gordon, and I guess he was supposed to be on here today somehow. He just signed up for it. And I wasn't going to say much, but other Kaha and others were going to talk to him if he is the main person, just like others who have been undermining us for a long, long time and watching us get abused and threatened and marginalized. Even though he is our council member in Glendale. He voted. He is the chairman of the housing committee. He's also the chairman of chairman of the housing committee, right? Yeah.
Yeah, he is. He is. And he has, because as in that position, he can write an ordinance and say, hey, we're not going to do this privatization, but he hasn't.
Yeah, he voted for the resolution. He pushed all of that. But when Black and brown people in his district, which is not a lot, I think we're the only group that's, I think.
No, it's Seward. There's a lot of.
Seward. Yeah. But when Black and brown people in his district talk to him, it's like we're invisible. But when white people call him, he will lie to them, act like he's a victim, act like he couldn't do anything, but behind our back, just do all kinds of things. So Alejandro Cano, all of them have been pushing the privatization of public housing. And so I'm just adding to what Kaha said about we started working with the Minneapolis Sanctuary movement to try to build just a larger coalition and trying to figure out how we can push for having immediate housing relief, which is not only building more public housing in the future, but also taking over all these empty units that have been built on tax credit and our tax dollars that are empty because nobody can afford to rent them. So, yeah. Somebody else.
Yeah. Okay, our demands, Jen H, our demands are on our website. So I can drop it in the chat and then you can go there. But yeah, I feel like I answered the bulk of the questions. We're coming up on 8 o'clock. I want to respect everybody's time. Does anybody else have anything they want to share? I'd love to hear what you all think and if you enjoyed the workshop, if you learned anything, and how you feel about public housing now. Are you excited about the potential of public housing as I am? Because I think public housing is amazing. So much can happen, great things when we invest in public housing and we make more of it. Imagine the end of homelessness. Imagine public housing. So how does everybody feel?
Great. I appreciate it. It was a great presentation. I want to say I grew up in public housing in Indianapolis and I look at things totally different now. Yeah, I'm on board.
Woo, woo. Okay. Anybody else?
Thank you, Kaha.
Thank you, Fatah. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. You did just such a good job.
Great. I'm so happy everybody found this so good. Yes, Rita?
Is there, can you share the slides with us afterwards?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That would be awesome.
Everybody can get an email with the slides.
Perfect. That would be great.
Any final questions?
I just have a question. Does everybody have access to the letter demands that we're asking people to send to the elected officials about stopping Section 8 and RAD? Or
can all those things be found on the Defend Glendale's website?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
We can find, and then we'll send them an email that has all of those things in there.
And a reminder for Sunday.
Oh yeah, Sunday. Make sure to come on Sunday. But yes, I think everybody's good. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kaha. This was awesome.
No problem.
Thank you, Kaha.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
All right, take care, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a
You're
good
welcome.
evening.
Okay,
Okay.
you too. Bye.